Welcome back to another Stand on Guard. Happy Monday. Hope you're having as good a time as I am and you had a great weekend. And that is always an important thing. So we'll be discussing a lot of issues this morning. I can't wait to get into this because there's been some very good news. We were expecting this Abacus poll to drop on Saturday, but instead it dropped Sunday. But we'll be discussing exactly what it means when we come back.
The Prime Minister lied and his minions continue to lie.
We need political change. But we also need to resolve to resist. Yes, please like and subscribe. We really need your subscriptions right now. Please subscribe and share the broadcast with your friends and family because YouTube will. And I want to thank also all of our supporters, all of our viewers on Rumble. We're getting bigger numbers on Rumble. Of course, you've got to diversify with social media because you never know what's going to happen. So we appreciate all of you. And of course, thank you for all the Substack folks who are also increasing in numbers. So before we get into this Abacus poll, which I think is fantastic news, and we'll just put that up because we're going to be discussing this. Conservatives edge ahead as cost of living dominates and Trump fades. Well, too bad this wasn't about 3 months ago, but it's inevitable. The truth will come out. And of course, as Mark Carney essentially saying last week, he made it all up during the election. He made up the Trump threat. He made up the U.S. threat. Now everything is just wonderful with the United States and Donald Trump. And he used it as a political wedge issue. And that's all it amounted to. But before we get to that, I want to share a couple of other things with you. And this is absolutely fascinating. This is wonderful news because, of course, as I pointed out, June is supposedly Pride Month in Canada, but Justin Trudeau mandated that we go to Pride season, meaning it's what, 3 months? Yeah, June, July, August. That's what he's talking about. Of course, if you're in the public service at a school, it's always Pride season. So the Pride Parade in Ottawa yesterday, excuse me, was actually sabotaged by Queers for Palestine. Their own people. Because of the infighting in the Gay Pride Committee that organizes this celebration of cyberitic rights, of outrageous hedonism. There was no Pride Parade. It was canceled. Oh, isn't that a tragedy? But here, I want to show some video on this because it's fascinating to me that this Sean Feucht actually shared video of this yesterday because this is really outrageous here. I'm going to go back to Sean Feucht's in a second here. But that's, this was incredible. Here we go. Let's have a look at this.
Parade. So here's the reason the parade is canceled. This canceled the entire parade. Very unhappy people here. As you can see, Palestinian protesters have completely shut down the Capitol Pride Parade. The parade was stalled out behind me here on Wellington Street for over an hour. I thought this might have been the trouble. The street and the whole rest of the parade is stuck way back there. Street closed. Wellington closed. They have taken over. Palestinians have shut down the Pride Parade.
And thank you, Chris Dacey, for that report yesterday. And Dacey Media, always like to give Chris a shout out for the good work he does. He's always on the streets, always doing a little bit of guerrilla journalism, as I call it, asymmetrical journalism. And thank you so much, Chris, for your hard work. And that was a great report. And of course, as Sean Feucht report in his X post, the left is eating the left. So it's always good news. Always good news. I want to get to this Abacus poll now from David Collinet, whom I knew from his days as the official pollster at Sun News when we used to have a television station running out of Toronto, and I worked with Sun News for 4 or 5 months, and then of course it folded after that, unfortunately. But this is absolutely fascinating because it's not just that the Conservatives have edged ahead of the Liberals. It's why they've edged ahead of the Liberals. So let's have a look at this in detail here, because I'm going to read this. This is David Coletto, who always does some really, really good work. So from August 15th to 19th, 2025, Abacus data surveyed 1,915 Canadian adults on the state of federal politics. The poll captures public opinion just as Air Canada flight attendants initiated strike action, but it's important to note that many of the interviews were completed prior to that event, and thus this wave does not fully reflect its impact. The same is true for Pierre Poilievre's by-election victory on Monday. That's interesting. What the data does show is a modest but meaningful shift. The Conservative Party has pulled slightly ahead in national vote intention for the first time in months. Yeah, first time before the election, probably. Meanwhile, the issue landscape remains anchored in affordability, with Donald Trump fading as a top-tier concern, a notable shift in a summer that's otherwise seen stability in attitudes. Despite these changes, government approval remains relatively steady, though with signs of erosion around economic management. Okay, the truth is starting to sink in. The political weather hasn't turned, but the winds may be shifting. Okay, I'm not, interesting metaphor. Coletto is clearly saying this is not yet a disaster. For the Liberals, Mark Carney is not in free fall, and the Liberal Party is not in free fall, but the winds have shifted, and there's going to be a gradual erosion of Liberal support. Just over a third of Canadians, 35%, believe the country is headed in the right direction. That's bad news for Carney. Essentially unchanged from early August. Meanwhile, 47% say things are on the wrong track. That's always bad news for the government. Views of the global outlook. 14% say the right direction. Whoa. Remain bleak, driven by persistent global uncertainty and lingering wariness toward U.S. leadership. So Canadians don't think we're on the right track with the world. Now, does that have something to do with Ukraine? Are Canadians beginning to say, why are we continuing to throw money at Ukraine into this bottomless pit? We'll get to that later. Now, I want to get into the top issues that are facing Canada, because this is quite interesting. The rising cost of living continues to dominate the political conversation, chosen by 60% of Canadians as one of their top 3 concerns. The broader economy follows at 36%, and housing at 35%. Healthcare ranks 4th at 33%. Donald Trump's influence as a political issue appears to be diminishing. Mentioned by 38% this wave, and down from 44% earlier in the summer, Trump now sits behind cost of living and is tied with the economy in salience. While still significant, his shadow is receding slightly, likely reflecting both Canadian fatigue and a slight cooling in the U.S. news coverage. Immigration remains in the middle of the pack, cited by 25%, and continues to be more polarizing than broadly resonant. So let's have a look at that. Top issues facing Canada. 60% say the rising cost of living. Now, if you live in Canada and if you buy groceries every week, I'm sure you've said, like I have, the inflation rate must be higher than what Statistics Canada is reporting. Because literally, the coffee beans I buy a year ago, perhaps, let's say 18 months ago, I was buying these same coffee beans for like $12. They're $20 now. $20. Now, Donald Trump remains second in his administration, but way down to 38%. The economy at 36%. Housing affordability, 35%. Healthcare, 33%. Immigration, 25%. So the red and the yellow, those are the top concerns. What are the concerns that really aren't registering with very many people? Now, this to me is just as important as the top issues facing Canada. We have climate change and the environment at 16%. The mainstream media consistently says climate change is one of the top issues for Canadians. The Liberal government pretends it's been a top issue with Canadians, the thing we should be most concerned about, most worried about. Crime and public safety, I'm surprised that's at 15%. Inequality and poverty is at 11%. The threat posed by China and Russia, 7%. So why are we always getting this Russia phobia? That Russia is going to invade Poland, that Russia is a grave and persistent threat. Russia is an existential threat to Canada. Obviously, Canadians are getting it. Indigenous reconciliation, 3%. Especially given the fact that now Aboriginal entitlement has completely undermined property rights in Canada. Now, Chinese election interference, the 2%, it's no wonder to me we never get any traction when we talk about Chinese election interference or how China has been spying on Canada. Now, government approval, still solid, but signs of softness. Approval of the Carney-led federal government stands at 49%, down a point from 2 weeks ago and below the 50% threshold for the first time since March. This approval has edged up to 80%. While these figures are still relatively strong, they point to a gradual softening. The government retains majority support, but the cost of living crunch and continued frustrations around housing may be beginning to wear on that goodwill. So I think the honeymoon is over. And Mark Carney, well, he's gone from a high of 51% down to 48%. Net, he still has a net favorable, but that can disappear overnight. I can just totally. And Pierre Poilievre, still, he's had a difficult summer. Net favorable is -2, but I think that's going to shift as well. And the main thing here, time for change or re-elect Liberals. Re-election is not looking good. Now let's get to the federal vote intention. Those certain to vote, it's a dead heat, 41-41. Yeah. And vote intention, Conservatives take the lead. If an election were held today, 41% of decided voters would cast a ballot for the Conservatives, up 1 point. The Liberals sit at 39%, down 4 points since early August. The NDP holds at 7, Bloc at 7, Greens at 2%, and the People's Party of Canada at 2%. Now, what does that tell me? I'm going to come back to the. What does that tell me? It tells me that the NDP has collapsed, remains collapsed. Support for the NDP is cratered, and it remains in the Conservative camp because of blue-collar support for the Tories. We saw that in the last election. We saw that in the election campaign. More blue-collar workers voting Conservative. More unions endorsing the Conservative Party and Pierre Poilievre. The union vote is no longer a given for the NDP because the NDP has become so woke, so strange, so misguided, so obsessed with wacko environmental policies, wacko LGBTQ agenda, that most ordinary blue collar workers are saying this party doesn't represent what I believe in, and probably hasn't for quite some time. So maybe it's time to look elsewhere. And that's exactly what has happened. Now, I want to get back to some of the tweets, or X posts from Sean Feucht. But before we get there, what's happening in Ukraine? Well, we talked about this yesterday. What Mark Carney is hell bent on giving your money away. Another $2 billion he's giving away to Ukraine. Now, where is it going? Into a bottomless pit. And Mark Carney cannot tell you that Ukraine is going to somehow win the war. They're not even talking about winning the war now. They're talking about winning the peace. And it doesn't matter what Russia wants. Well, of course, if you have any understanding about the world, and Mark Carney, remember, he said, I understand the world. You know, the country that finishes the war in the dominant position dictates what happens. And that's exactly what's going to happen in Ukraine. Crimea is not going back to Ukraine. And Mark Carney can pretend that he doesn't understand it, or he doesn't really want to acknowledge it. Notwithstanding, that's the reality that Mark Carney should be acknowledging. Let's listen to Carney talk about potentially putting Canadian troops in Ukraine.
Now, and the funds are flowing. So this is immediate. We know the immediate needs, and we, as a partner of Ukraine, are working directly, for example, in joint production, which you just referenced, but then more broadly buying in drones from other sources, and also following the Danish model, the pre-financing model, for production here in Ukraine. With respect to security guarantees, I think we all recognize that the core of the security guarantee, the front line, the foundation, is robust Ukrainian armed forces. And it's crucial in those regards that the military equipment today and tomorrow is here, the industrial capacity is here. It's crucial that the training capacity.
It's so agonizing to listen to Mark Carney speak, because he's one of the worst public speakers ever to occupy the office of Canadian Prime Minister. He cannot get through a sentence, let alone a paragraph, without and that's because he really doesn't know what he wants to articulate. He is really making it up as he goes along. I think this is a prime minister who is way beyond his depth. Not that he's a stupid man, he's a very clever man. But he's wondering, how do I put this over on Canadians? How do I convince them that I really have an agenda that is consistent with what's best for Canada? Because I keep lying. I keep making it up. Sooner or later, Canadians are going to wonder what's up.
City is there as well. And I'd note that since Russia's illegal seizure of Crimea, Operation Unifier, which Canada put in place, has trained over 45,000 Ukrainian troops. This will become even more important going forward. That's the front line, but that's should be buttressed by the coalition of the willing, potentially the United States, in matters of intelligence and other support. We are working through with our allies in the coalition of the willing, and with.
Now, where have you heard coalition of the willing before? This is quite interesting, because Mark Carney uses phrases and uses terminology because he is intending to get a point across. We had a coalition of the willing in the Iraq War, which actually Canada didn't get involved in. At the time, I want to tell you, I was completely supportive of the Iraq War. I thought Canada should have sent troops. We should have had a military contingent of some kind. And I criticized then Prime Minister Jean Chrétien vigorously for not doing so. Of course, I've since realized that the Iraq War was based on a completely false and mendacious premise that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. As it turned out, it was completely bogus. It was made up. And of course, Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. That as well was made up. But George Herbert Walker Bush, President Bush at the time, talked about a coalition of the willing. So here we go again. But this time, this is a coalition of the willing to what? Send troops to Ukraine and potentially fight Russia? Is this what Mark Carney really wants? Well, this is the talk we hear from people like UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, from French President Emmanuel Macron. They're actually talking about potentially going to war with Russia, which of course would be catastrophic. And Canada is in no position to threaten Russia or to promise Ukraine anything except more billions of dollars that will pour into the black hole of Kiev and into Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's pockets. And that's what we're dealing with Ukraine. It is a potential quagmire for foreign interference, foreign military interference. But I predict this war is going to be over before people like Mark Carney can decide who controls what.
Ukraine, the modalities of those security guarantees on the land, in the air, and the sea, and I would not exclude the presence of troops. Yeah. We need a cessation of hostilities. We need a ceasefire. We can call it a ceasefire, a truce, an armistice. That's necessary to stop the killing. But the conditions around that.
There is a difference, actually, between a ceasefire and armistice and a truce. Yeah, there are differences between these words. And Mark Carney is being deliberately vague and ambiguous about this because Mark Carney doesn't have a plan. And he knows this is ultimately between Russia and Ukraine, and even Donald Trump isn't going to issue any verdict, ultimatum, demands, because Donald Trump is smart enough to know he can be a mediator, he can be an interlocutor in the peace process, but the United States knows it's not going to dictate terms. And Mark Carney, I'm sorry, you're a joke if you think you're going to do this.
There will be military force in Ukraine, Ukrainian military force. There'll be no exclusion of pathways for Ukraine to the European Union or to NATO for that matter, pathways towards. And there will be security guarantees.
This is some of the most incredible propaganda because here they've got what looks like the best of their troops lined up here, looking smart in their combat fatigues, looking ready and capable. They probably found what might be the last and the best of their troops and put them on display in Kiev just for Mark Carney, because the Ukrainians are actually using 16-year-olds and 60-year-olds to fight this war because there's none of these types left. In other words, people of real military age, the fittest, the toughest. Most of them are dead. According to Colonel Doug McGregor, who's been on the show many times, it's 1.8 to 2 million Ukrainians might have died in this war so far. Ukraine is a vanishing nation because of this war. And because people like Mark Carney have perpetuated this war for years with more military and civil aid to Ukraine, a lot of it has gone into the pockets of corrupt politicians and to Swiss bank accounts.
There will be security guarantees in any durable ceasefire. That's the lesson of Minsk. That's the lesson of 2014. That's the lesson of history, is that we need not to trust and verify, but deter and fortify. And the fortification, the deterrence, is anchored in those security guarantees. Again, as I said, starting with the Ukrainian army and reinforcing that, but then being buttressed by the coalition of the willing. And again, I welcome, without specifying, welcome the openness of President Trump to some form of U.S. participation in that. Now, all of this in real time, as you ask your question, is under discussion about the specificities and the modalities. But it's not the choice of Russia how the future sovereignty, independence, liberty of Ukraine is guaranteed. It's the choice of Ukraine and the decisions of the partners.
Actually, at this point, it's very little to do with the decision of Ukraine. They've lost the war. And that's political military reality, which Mark Carney seems incapable of embracing or understanding at this point. But that's reality. I want to play a clip from Pierre Poilievre because this is Pierre Poilievre resurgent. This is before he saw yesterday's poll, and I can tell you this. There was joy in the Conservative Party headquarters yesterday when they saw they finally reached a turning point, a turnaround. The honeymoon for Mark Carney is over. And it's only going to get worse because Mark Carney has nothing to offer except more falsehoods, more false promises, more policies that go nowhere except further economic ruin. And Mark Carney built his government on a house of cards. And that house of cards is collapsing. It's falling because there's nothing there. But here's an issue Pierre Poilievre can use, not only to maintain his control of the Conservative Party of Canada as its leader, as he needs to run to the right in anticipation of that next leadership vote. But this is an issue that is going to resonate with all Canadians because they're sick of liberals or faux conservatives like Doug Ford, who pretends he's outraged over home invasions, but does nothing about it. This is a great statement by Pierre Poilievre.
Law needs to be clear that if someone comes into your house uninvited to steal your property or harm your family, you need to be able to do whatever is necessary to stop them. And my message to the criminal thugs who are invading the homes of Canadians in unprecedented numbers because of liberal laws is that you should be in serious danger if you go into someone's house illegally and try to harm them. If you don't want to be harmed, then don't invade someone's house and don't threaten their security. The law needs to be very clear that people have the right to defend their homes and their families against lawbreakers.
Yeah, I borrowed that from the Conservative Party. So anyway, that was very, very good. We need castle law in Canada, where you don't talk about reasonable force, talk about whatever force is necessary to expel home invaders. Let's not mince our words. Because you put reasonable in any law, it's going to be eviscerated by woke politicians and woke lawyers and woke judges who are going to say, well, that wasn't reasonable. And nothing will be reasonable for people who think the criminals should have more rights than the victims, who think the criminals have a perfect right to enter your home. If you try to stop them, you're the guilty one. And that's the conundrum for the woke politician, because they can't justify that. It doesn't make any sense. And most people with half a brain will say, I think if a home intruder comes in and tries to steal my property, threaten my life, violate my privacy, endanger the lives of my family, my wife, my husband, my children, then I think I have a right to stop them. And Poilievre is right on track with this. Now, I'm going to come back in a second with some more thoughts from our friend Sean Feucht, but we'll be right back after this brief announcement about our merchandise. I encourage you to have a look at the store. Some of you have been very generous lately, and I thank you for your generosity and for buying some of the material. They have some of the merchandise there, which I think is, well, we're quite proud of it. And I thank you for taking an interest in it. Now, we want to go back to, I'm going to go back to Sean Feucht's X posting here, because this absolutely, I find this absolutely astounding here. Because Sean Feucht was in Abbotsford last night. It was the concluding city of his tour. He had nothing but difficulty with the Abbotsford mayor and the town council. They didn't want him there. But here, Sean Feucht reposts this message from the real Mr. Bench. And Sean says, but for safety concerns, guys. And this is what city politicians and the media across Canada view as a safety concern. People in Abbotsford worshiping Jesus at the Let Us Worship concert led by Sean Feucht in Abbotsford. That's the danger. We saw the DC media. Sean Feucht writes, the only one to end the most wild, exhausting, beautiful, and unpredictable God journey from coast to coast across 11 cities in Canada. And I say again, the only city that Sean Feucht played in, make Canada free again, yeah. The only city that Sean Feucht played in where there was no opposition, I mean, from the city, was Edmonton, because the Premier of Alberta invited Sean to perform on the steps of the legislature. Thank you very much for that, Premier Danielle Smith. Thanks for being a leader, a real leader. And here he is. The city of Abbotsford said no. God said yes. Here's another one. The liberal mainstream media is going to live stream tonight from the U.S.-Canada border. You can't make this up. Worship and the preaching of the gospel being broadcast across the nation. Yeah. And he has been smeared. Actually, so I'm wrong. Saskatoon said yes. Every other Canadian city, with the exception of Edmonton and Saskatoon, tried to prevent Sean from performing because they don't believe in freedom of religion. They don't believe in free speech. They don't believe in freedom of assembly. They believe in nothing except woke politics. These people must go. We have got to return to something resembling democratic freedom in this country. And foundational to democratic freedom is freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly. All of these things are under attack from the Carney liberals, just as they were under the Trudeau liberals. Mark Carney said nothing about the violating freedom of religion. When Sean Feucht came here in July, he said nothing this week when he experienced the same kind of activity. He will say nothing because he does not believe in freedom of religion. And remember what Pierre Poilievre said the other day.
What people are seeing is that Mark Carney, while he promised, he made grand promises of change, he's even worse than Justin Trudeau.
So my lesson for you today, Mark Carney is even worse than Justin Trudeau. He is going to plummet in the polls just as Justin Trudeau did, just as Justin did. Yes, that's on the horizon for Mark Carney. So take heart, let not your hearts be troubled. We're fighting back. So this has been David Krayden, broadcasting to you live from our nation's capital, or broadcasting, sorry, from our nation's capital. It's always a pleasure. Have a great rest of your Monday, and I'll be back tomorrow at the same time at 10 a.m. Want to add, though, on Sundays, we're going to be starting a half hour earlier at 9:30 because it's a little hard to get things ready to go to church on Sunday morning when I do a 10 o'clock broadcast. So I'm going to move the time only on Sunday to 9:30. Thank you for your support. Thank you for watching. And we'll see you again tomorrow. This has been David Krayden from Stand on Guard. God bless this country. And Godspeed.